Welcome to Story Planet, a place where winter journeys unfold, where lanterns glow softly and the past lingers, waiting to be found. Here, time slows, footsteps echo on frozen paths, and whispers drift beneath the northern lights. Step into the Winter Caravan, where the reindeer tread ancient trails, and home is not just a place but a memory, waiting to be uncovered. Let yourself journey through the Arctic wilderness, where lost letters find their way back, and every path leads to the heart of the past. Take a breath, close your eyes, and let the story carry you home. 1882, the first snowfall. The first snowfall of winter arrived in Stockholm with a hush, blanketing the streets in a soft layer of white. The city, usually bustling with hurried footsteps and lively chatter, had fallen into a rare silence, as if the world itself was taking a deep breath. Inside a small tailoring shop, nestled between a bakery and an old bookstore, Astrid Linda folded a length of fine wool, her fingers tracing the delicate embroidery along its hem. The shop belonged to her late mother, a skilled seamstress whose hands had stitched warmth into every coat, scarf, and mitten that passed through its doors. Now, it was Astrid's turn to carry on the tradition, though there were moments, especially on days like this, when she felt as if she were only mending the past rather than stepping into the future. The air inside smelled of warm fabric, lavender sachets, and a hint of cinnamon from the bakery next door. The golden glow of lanterns reflected off the frost-lined windows, creating the illusion of fireflies dancing in the cold. Astrid had always found comfort in this small world, where every stitch she sewed felt like an act of preservation, of holding on to something fleeting. The soft chime of the doorbell pulled her from her thoughts. A gust of cold air swept into the shop, along with a swirl of snowflakes that melted instantly upon the wooden floor. A tall man in a heavy wool coat stepped inside, shaking the frost from his shoulders. His face was weathered but kind, his mustache dusted with snow. He removed his hat, revealing Elias Halverson, a longtime family friend and one of the few remaining reindeer herders of Lapland. "Astrid," Elias greeted, his voice deep and steady. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," she said, offering him a seat by the stove. "It's been too long." Elias nodded, his expression turning serious as he reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "I came to deliver this," he said, placing the letter in her hands. The envelope was worn, its edges soft from time, the ink slightly faded. Astrid turned it over, her breath catching when she saw the sender's name. Maren Lindstrom. "My mother's name," she whispered, looking up at Elias. "But she's been gone for years." Elias sighed, shifting in his seat. "Your mother sent this letter before she passed, asking that it be given to you when you were ready. I don't know what's inside, but I do know she wanted you to have it now." Astrid's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Unfolding the delicate paper, she took a deep breath and began to read.
My dearest Astrid, by the time you read this, winter will have come again, and the snows of the north will be calling. There's something I never told you, something I left behind when I chose to leave Lapland. A part of our family's past remains there, waiting to be found. You are never meant to stay in one place, my love. There is more for you beyond the walls of our little shop. Follow the caravan. It will lead you home. With love, always, Mama.
Astrid read the words twice, her mind racing. Her mother had never spoken of Lapland, of the life she had left behind. Yet here it was, written in her own hand, urging Astrid to go back to a place she had never known. Elias watched her carefully. "The Winter Caravan leaves in 3 days," he said gently. "It's the last one before the deep snows make travel impossible. If you wish to go, I will take you with us." Astrid looked down at the letter once more, her mother's words swirling in her mind. The thought of leaving Stockholm, of stepping away from the only life she had known, was daunting. But something deep inside her stirred, a quiet yearning she couldn't ignore. She stood, walking to the window and watching the snow drift lazily through the glow of the street lanterns. Somewhere far beyond the city, beyond the world she knew, was the land her mother had once called home. A place of frozen lakes, whispering forests, and skies that shimmered with the northern lights. She lifted her gaze to Elias, determination settling in her chest. "I'll go." The older man smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Then be ready, Astrid. The north is waiting for you." That night, as she lay in bed, she held the letter close to her chest, feeling its fragile weight against her heartbeat. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the city in silence. But inside her something new stirred. A restless anticipation, a quiet thrill. For the first time in years, she was finally about to step into a story of her own. And this time, she would let the winter guide her home. The morning of departure arrived cloaked in frost, the kind that turned windows into lace and made breath curl like smoke in the air. Astrid stood outside her shop, bundled in a thick wool cloak, her gloved hands tightening around the leather straps of her bag. Behind her, the little tailoring shop that had been her world for so long seemed smaller now, tucked between the bakery and the bookstore, its sign dusted with fresh snow. She had spent the past 3 days preparing, yet now, with her boots sinking into the snow-covered cobblestones, she hesitated. Stockholm had always been home, the rhythm of the city as familiar as the pulse in her own wrist, the distant echo of carriage wheels, the warmth of the bakery's morning bread, the flickering lanterns that lined the narrow streets. These were the details of her life. And yet, she was leaving it behind for something unknown. The clatter of hooves on ice made her turn. Elias Halvorsen was waiting a few paces away, standing beside a large wooden sled packed high with supplies. His reindeer shifted restlessly, their breath forming small clouds in the air. Further down the street, the rest of the caravan was gathering outside the city gates, traders and travelers alike, adjusting their harnesses, checking their provisions. "You're certain?" Elias asked as she approached, his eyes studying her with quiet understanding. Astrid exhaled. The weight of her mother's letter pressed against her heart. Doubt still lingered at the edges of her thoughts, but beneath it was something stronger, a pull like an invisible thread leading her forward. She nodded. "I'm ready." Elias said nothing more, simply offering a small nod before helping her onto the sled. She settled in among the furs and blankets, tucking her bag beside her. The cold bit at her cheeks, but the excitement simmering beneath her ribs kept her warm. With a low call, Elias signaled to his reindeer, and the sled lurched forward. The bells on their harnesses jingled softly, a melody that blended with the crunch of snow beneath the runners. As the caravan began its slow, steady departure, Astrid cast one last glance over her shoulder. The city was already fading, swallowed by mist, its rooftops softened by the distance. She didn't know when or if she would return. The road north unfolded before them, a ribbon of white winding through towering pine forests and frozen rivers locked in ice. The world beyond the city felt different, untouched, as if time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of their travel. The days were short, the sun lingering only briefly before dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of lavender and gold. At night, the stars stretched endlessly overhead, unbroken by rooftops or city lanterns, their light reflecting off the snow in a shimmer of silver. The caravan moved in a steady rhythm, the sleds gliding over the hardened paths, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. At first, Astrid simply listened, absorbing the sounds of the journey, the creak of leather harnesses, the occasional murmur of conversation, the distant call of an owl echoing through the trees. It was different from the city's hum, quieter but no less alive. Elias, seated beside her, guided the reins with practiced ease. "This is your first journey this far north, isn't it?" he asked, his voice carrying over the wind. She nodded. "My mother never spoke much of Lapland. She left before I was born." Elias hummed thoughtfully. She was a remarkable woman, strong-willed, but the North is not easily forgotten. You may find more of her here than you expect. The words settled in Astrid's chest like embers, warming something deep inside her. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, watching the trees blur past as they ventured deeper into the wilderness. By the third night, the caravan set up camp in a valley sheltered from the wind. Fires flickered among the tents, casting golden light on the snow. Astrid sat close to the flames, cradling a tin cup of warm broth between her hands. Around her, the travelers spoke in quiet voices, sharing stories of past journeys, of lost traditions and old winter legends. She listened, drawn into their words. One man, a trader from the east, spoke of the night fires, a phenomenon where the northern lights were said to carry the whispers of those who had walked the land before them. Another told of the lost caravan, a group of travelers who had vanished in a blizzard long ago, their footprints never found. Elias caught her gaze, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Every journey carries stories with it," he said. "Some of them true, some of them only half remembered, but all of them matter." Astrid turned her gaze upward. The sky above was a deep indigo, the stars scattered like silver dust. Then, as if on cue, a faint ribbon of green shimmered across the heavens. The aurora borealis, shifting like silk in the wind. The sight stole her breath. She had seen paintings of it before, heard travelers speak of its beauty, but nothing compared to seeing it with her own eyes. The lights pulsed, stretched, curled in slow waves as if they too were on a journey of their own. For the first time since leaving the city, Astrid felt it. The beginning of something. Not just a journey north, but a journey into a part of herself she had never known. She thought of her mother's letter. "Follow the caravan. It will lead you home." And for the first time, she wondered if she had already found it. The caravan pressed on through the ever-deepening winter, the rhythmic crunch of sled runners on snow becoming a familiar melody in Astrid's ears. The world had transformed into an endless stretch of white, interrupted only by the dark silhouettes of towering pines and the occasional frozen river, its surface shimmering under the pale light of the sun. Each day, they traveled further north, into a land where the sky seemed closer, where time felt slower, and where the wind carried whispers of stories long forgotten. On the sixth evening, just as the sun began its early descent, Elias signaled for the caravan to halt. Ahead of them, nestled between snow-covered hills, lay a small village. Smoke curled from chimneys, the scent of burning pine wood carried on the crisp air. Warm light glowed from the windows of timber-framed cottages, their roofs heavy with layers of frost. "We'll stay here for the night," Elias announced, stepping down from the sled and stretching his limbs. "The elders here are friends to travelers, and their hearths are always open." Astrid watched as the villagers emerged from their homes, wrapped in heavy furs, their faces lined with both age and warmth. A woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes stepped forward, her gaze settling on Elias with recognition. "Elias Halvorsen," she said with a smile, her voice rich with familiarity. "You bring winter guests as always." "And you offer them shelter, as always, Ingrid," Elias replied, shaking her hand. Astrid followed as they were led into the heart of the village, where a communal longhouse stood, its heavy wooden doors adorned with intricate carvings of reindeer, swirling winds, and celestial patterns. Inside, the warmth was immediate, the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread filling the air. Fur-lined benches surrounded a great stone hearth, where flames danced and crackled, casting shifting shadows along the wooden walls. Astrid sank into the warmth, stretching her fingers toward the fire. The cold had become a familiar companion, but now that she was inside, she realized how deeply it had settled into her bones. A steaming cup of spiced cider was pressed into her hands by a woman who introduced herself as Ingrid's daughter, Freya. "You're new to the caravan," Freya observed, settling beside her. Astrid nodded. "It's my first journey north." Freya studied her with curiosity. "Then you must hear the stories of the lights." Astrid turned to her, intrigued. "The northern lights?" Freya smiled. "Here we call them the sky dancers. They are more than light. They are messages from those who came before us, guiding us, warning us, reminding us that we are never truly alone." A hush fell over the longhouse as Ingrid rose, her presence commanding the attention of all within. She lifted her hands, and silence settled like freshly fallen snow. "The sky dancers have been seen in great numbers this winter," she said. "They whisper of change, of something waking in the north." A murmur ran through the room. Astrid felt the weight of Ingrid's words settle over her like a cloak. Change. Hadn't she already felt it ever since she left Stockholm? Hadn't she sensed it in the quiet pull of the wind, in the stories passed between travelers, in the way the auroras seemed to stretch their fingers toward her? As the evening wore on, Astrid found herself drawn outside, the night vast and still. The village lay blanketed in a peaceful quiet, only the distant howl of wolves punctuating the silence. Overhead, the northern lights swirled, painting the sky in ribbons of green and violet. She exhaled, watching her breath merge with the winter air. She was further from home than she had ever been, yet something in her heart whispered that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Tomorrow, the journey would continue. But tonight, under the watchful gaze of the sky dancers, she let herself belong to the moment, and for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. Morning arrived in a soft hush, the sky barely touched by the first hints of dawn. The snow-covered village still slumbered beneath a thick quilt of frost, but the caravan was already preparing to depart. Astrid wrapped her wool cloak tightly around her shoulders, her breath curling into the air as she followed Elias toward the sleds. Despite the early hour, the village elders had gathered to see them off, offering bundles of dried meats, thick knitted mittens, and whispered blessings for safe passage. Before climbing onto the sled, Astrid caught sight of Freya standing by the longhouse entrance, her arms crossed against the cold. A flicker of hesitation passed through Astrid. There was something about this village, something unspoken that lingered in the air like the scent of burning pine. "You should be careful on the river path," Freya said suddenly, as if she had sensed Astrid's thoughts. "It's said the ice holds memories." Astrid frowned. "Memories?" Freya nodded, her expression unreadable. "Some say if you listen closely enough, you can hear voices beneath the ice." A chill passed over Astrid, and not from the cold. But before she could ask more, Elias called for her, and she turned away, stepping onto the sled beside him. The reindeer tossed their heads, their breath rising in plumes of silver mist. With a sharp call, the caravan began its slow, steady journey once more, leaving the warmth of the village behind. The path ahead wound through towering firs, heavy with snow, their branches bowing under the weight. The sled glided smoothly over the frozen terrain, the only sounds the soft jingle of harness bells and the distant caw of ravens. Hours passed in a comfortable silence, but Astrid couldn't shake Freya's words from her mind. It wasn't until midday that they reached the river, a vast, frozen expanse stretching as far as the eye could see. The ice gleamed under the weak winter sun, a glassy mirror reflecting the pale sky. Elias guided the sled cautiously onto the ice, the runners gliding effortlessly over its smooth surface. Astrid leaned forward, studying the frozen river beneath them. She could see deep fissures and cracks running through the ice like veins, a frozen labyrinth of time locked away beneath their feet. She shivered. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it, as if the ice held secrets meant to stay buried. The caravan continued forward, but just as Astrid was about to look away, something caught her eye, a faint shadow beneath the ice, shifting, moving. She gasped, her grip tightening on the edge of the sled. "Elias," she whispered urgently, "stop." He pulled on the reins, and the sled came to a gradual halt. The others followed suit, murmurs of curiosity spreading among the travelers. "What is it?" Elias asked, scanning the horizon. Astrid hesitated, uncertain of what she had seen. "There's something beneath the ice." Elias frowned but nodded. He stepped down from the sled, his boots crunching against the ice as he approached the spot Astrid indicated. The rest of the caravan watched in silence, the air heavy with anticipation. Then, with a sudden gust of wind, the ice beneath them groaned. The sound echoed across the river, deep and resonant, like a distant voice calling from below. Astrid's breath caught in her throat. Was it only the shifting of the ice? Or something else? Elias knelt, brushing away a thin layer of snow. Beneath the clear ice, barely visible, was a dark shape, a wooden sled, trapped beneath the frozen surface. And beside it, wrapped in thick furs, lay the faint outline of a figure. Gasps rippled through the group. Astrid's pulse pounded in her ears as she crouched beside Elias, her hands trembling slightly as she stared down into the ice. The figure was motionless, preserved by the frost, as if frozen in time itself. "This is no accident," Elias murmured, his voice grim. "This man has been waiting here for a long time." Astrid swallowed hard, a strange, inexplicable sorrow blooming in her chest. The ice had indeed held memories, and now they had uncovered one that had been waiting to be told. The wind howled through the trees, carrying whispers over the frozen river. And for the first time Astrid understood what Freya had meant. Some voices never truly fade. They only wait for someone to listen. The frozen river stretched endlessly before them, a glassy expanse of silver blue beneath the pale winter sky. The caravan stood in hushed silence, gathered around the dark silhouette trapped beneath the ice. The wind stirred softly, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant wood smoke, but Astrid hardly noticed. Her eyes remained fixed on the figure below, her breath caught between unease and sorrow. Elias, his expression unreadable, knelt beside the ice once more, running his gloved fingers over its smooth surface. The transparency of the frozen river made it appear as though time itself had preserved this lost traveler, cocooning him in a world where the seasons no longer changed. The man beneath the ice, whoever he had been, had become part of the landscape, a whisper of the past caught between two worlds. "This is no accident," Elias murmured again, his breath a warm mist against the cold air. "This sled, the way he's lying, it looks as if he was searching for something." Astrid tore her gaze from the ice and glanced around. The riverbank loomed in the distance, a jagged edge of snow-covered rock and fir trees. If this traveler had been moving toward the shore when the ice gave way, it meant he had been close, so very close, to safety. A heavy hand on her shoulder made her jump. She turned to see one of the older traders, Henrik, watching her with wise, solemn eyes. "There are stories of lost caravans," he said quietly. "Men who wandered too far from their paths, who met their end in the cold. Some say their spirits still travel with the winter winds, whispering to those who will listen." Astrid swallowed, recalling Freya's words from the night before. "Some say if you listen closely enough, you can hear voices beneath the ice." She took a step closer to Elias, her own breath unsteady. Can we bring him out?" Elias hesitated, exchanging glances with the other traders. "The ice is thick, but we need to be careful." He stood, brushing the frost from his knees. "We'll mark this place and return. We need tools, warmth, and time." A murmur of agreement spread through the caravan. With one last lingering look at the man below, the travelers turned their sleds toward the distant tree line, where they would make camp before attempting to retrieve him. The fire crackled gently in the quiet camp. the scent of burning pine mixed with the rich aroma of stew simmering over the flames, but Astrid barely tasted her meal. The image of the frozen traveler remained in her thoughts, lingering like a shadow just beyond her vision. "Tell me what's on your mind," Elias said, lowering himself onto the log beside her. The firelight played across his face, making him look older, the lines of worry carved deeper than before. Astrid hesitated. I keep thinking about him. What was he doing there? What was he looking for?" She shook her head, her fingers tightening around the wool blanket draped over her shoulders. "It feels wrong to leave him there." Elias nodded slowly, staring into the fire. "It does." They sat in silence for a long while, the only sound the occasional snap of burning wood. Then Elias reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. He handed it to her without a word. Astrid glanced at him questioningly before flipping the cover open. The pages inside were filled with careful, slanted handwriting, names, dates, locations, a record of travelers lost to the northern snows. Elias watched her as she turned the pages. Every winter, people go missing in the tundra. Some are found, most are not, but we remember them. Astrid's fingers brushed the inked names, feeling the weight of them. The caravan wasn't just carrying goods and supplies. They were carrying stories, lives, echoes of those who had walked this path before them. "We'll return for him," Elias said firmly. "No one should be forgotten." Astrid nodded, clutching the book close. She wasn't sure why, but something about this traveler, this frozen man beneath the ice, felt different. As if his story wasn't finished yet. As if someone was waiting for him to be found. Outside the circle of firelight, the wind whispered through the trees. And for the first time since setting out on this journey, Astrid had the unsettling feeling that the past was watching her, waiting for its story to be told. The morning air was brittle with cold, the kind that seeped into bones and left a lingering ache in the fingertips. The sun barely touched the horizon, casting a pale light over the frozen river. The wind had died in the night, leaving behind an eerie silence, as if the land itself was waiting. Astrid wrapped her woolen cloak tightly around her shoulders as she followed Elias and the others back to the marked spot on the ice. The caravan moved slowly, their sleds laden with supplies, their voices hushed in the crisp morning air. The fire from the night before had done little to warm her. The thought of the frozen traveler had kept her awake, her mind spinning with unanswered questions. As they reached the river's edge, the group spread out, some checking the ice for stability while others unpacked the tools they had brought. Axes, ropes, wooden poles. Elias knelt at the marked spot, brushing away the fresh dusting of snow to reveal the silhouette beneath once more. "There he is," he murmured, "frozen in time." Astrid hesitated before stepping forward. The ice was so clear that she could see the details of the sled, the worn fur-lined coat, the gloved hands still clutching the wooden reins. She expected the sight to unsettle her, but instead she felt something else entirely, an overwhelming sadness. Henrik, the older trader, ran a hand over his beard. "We'll have to be careful breaking the ice. We don't want to disturb the river's hold too much." Elias nodded. "We'll work slowly." The first strike of the axe rang out across the silence, sharp and deliberate. The ice splintered slightly, sending tiny fissures outward like veins in glass. The men took turns working, each blow careful, measured. The sound became rhythmic, blending with the slow exhale of their breath and the soft crunch of shifting snow underfoot. Astrid stood to the side, watching. She felt as if she were witnessing the unraveling of a forgotten story, one that had remained frozen in place for far too long. As the ice weakened, Elias signaled for ropes to be fastened around the sled. It took time measured in aching muscles and labored breath. But slowly, piece by piece, the past was pulled to the surface. The sled emerged first, the wood warped but still intact. Then came the traveler himself, his body still wrapped in layers of fur and wool, his features obscured by frost. The group worked in quiet reverence, lowering him gently onto a bed of pine branches they had prepared on the riverbank. Astrid stepped closer, kneeling beside him. His face, now visible in the dim winter light, was younger than she had expected. Lines of hardship were etched into his brow, but there was something peaceful about him, as if he had met his fate without fear. And then something caught her eye. Tucked into the folds of his coat was a small leather pouch. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it. The leather was stiff from the cold, the drawstring frozen in place, but she worked it open, her breath catching as she pulled out what lay inside. A letter, sealed, untouched. The wax insignia still pressed firmly against the parchment. The caravan gathered around her as she turned it over, the name scrawled in faded ink sending a shiver through her. Maren Lindstrom. Astrid's heart stopped. She knew that name, not from stories or old caravan tales. She knew that name because it belonged to her grandmother. A sharp gust of wind swept across the river, rattling the branches of the nearby trees. The fire crackled behind them, casting long shadows across the snow. But Astrid barely noticed. Her fingers tightened around the letter, her mind racing. This wasn't just a forgotten traveler. This wasn't just another story buried in the ice. This man had been carrying a message meant for her family. A message that had been waiting to be read for decades. The past had called her north, pulling her along the same path her ancestors had once walked. And now, here she was, standing over a truth that had remained frozen for generations. She looked at Elias, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to open this." The wind howled through the trees once more, but this time Astrid thought she could hear something else carried within it. A name, a whisper, a call from the past, finally being heard. The fire crackled gently in the evening hush, its golden glow casting flickering shadows across the snow-packed ground. The air was thick with the scent of burning pine, mingling with the silence that had settled over the camp. Astrid sat close to the warmth, the unopened letter resting in her lap. Her fingers hovered over the worn parchment, tracing the edges of the wax seal as if by doing so she could somehow prepare herself for whatever lay inside. Elias sat across from her, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. He said nothing, but she could feel his presence like an anchor in the storm of her thoughts. Henrik and the other traders had given her space, murmuring amongst themselves near the sleds. They, too, felt the weight of what had been discovered beneath the ice. A frozen traveler from another time. A letter addressed to her grandmother. Astrid swallowed. She had been called here by something greater than curiosity. She had followed the whispers of the north, the pull of the past, and now she had the key to a story long buried in the snow. She exhaled and pressed her thumb against the wax seal. It broke with a soft snap, the aged parchment crackling as she unfolded the letter. The ink had faded but remained legible, the handwriting strong and slanted as if written with urgency. She steadied herself and began to read.
Maren, my love, I have done what I must, though my heart aches for you. The road ahead is long and the ice is treacherous, but I will not return until I have secured what was promised. I will meet you beneath the lantern at the edge of the village when the snows settle. If I do not return before the last snowfall, do not wait for me. I will find you when the river thaws. You are my home always. Yours, Johan.
Astrid's breath hitched. The name sent a shiver down her spine, though she had never heard it spoken in her family's stories. Johan, a name lost to time, sealed in the ice for decades. She read the letter again, slower this time, letting the words sink in. This man, Johan, had set out on a journey, knowing the dangers that lay ahead, and he had not returned. She looked up at Elias, her voice barely above a whisper. This man, he was waiting for her, but she never knew. Elias nodded slowly, his gaze heavy with understanding. Some love stories never get their ending. The fire crackled, sending up a shower of glowing embers. The realization settled deep in Astrid's chest. Her grandmother had lived her life never knowing that Johann had tried to return to her, that he had risked everything to fulfill a promise. A sharp gust of wind rattled the trees, sending loose snow drifting down from the branches. Astrid's thoughts churned. If Johann had written this letter, it meant he had intended to return to her grandmother. But why? What had he gone to secure? What promise had kept him away? She folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the pouch. I need to know more, she said, meeting Elias's eyes. There has to be more to this story. He considered her for a moment, then nodded. Then we follow the trail he left behind. The decision was made. In the morning, they would retrace Johann's last journey, piecing together the path he had taken before he had been swallowed by the ice. The past had waited long enough. That night, as Astrid lay beneath the thick firs, listening to the distant howl of wolves in the valley, she held the letter close to her chest. The cold no longer seemed as bitter, the wind no longer as lonely. For the first time since arriving in the north, she felt as though she was exactly where she was meant to be. And beneath the endless sky, where the northern lights flickered like whispered secrets, she knew. Some stories never truly fade. They simply wait to be found. Morning arrived in a hush, the sky painted in pale gold and soft grays as the first rays of light stretched over the frozen landscape. The embers of the night's fire still smoldered, sending faint wisps of smoke curling into the crisp air. Astrid sat up slowly, the thick furs draped around her shoulders still holding the remnants of warmth. The weight of the letter tucked into her coat was a reminder that today they were setting out to retrace Johann's final steps. Elias was already awake, his breath rising in steady puffs as he checked the sled harnesses. Henrik and the other traders moved with quiet efficiency, packing supplies and preparing for the journey ahead. There was no need for words. Everyone knew what they were setting out to do. Astrid pulled her gloves snug over her fingers and rose to join Elias. He nodded toward the horizon, where the snow-covered hills rolled endlessly into the distance. If Johann was traveling toward the village, he would have come from the old mountain pass. That's where we start. The reindeer snorted softly as the sleds moved into motion, gliding over the frozen terrain with ease. The path they followed was barely visible, a mere suggestion in the vast expanse of untouched snow. As they climbed higher into the hills, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees like voices calling from the past. Hours passed, the journey punctuated by brief pauses to scan the landscape for any sign of the past. They stopped at a frozen brook, where Elias examined the ice for markings, then at a break in the tree line where a few weathered posts jutted from the ground, remnants of an old trail long abandoned. It wasn't until midday, when the sun sat low and pale in the sky, that Astrid spotted something in the distance. A dark shape, barely visible against the blinding white of the snow. She pointed ahead. There, do you see it? Elias followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing. Without hesitation, they urged the sleds forward, the runners hissing against the frost. As they approached, the shape became clearer. A collapsed wooden shelter, its roof caved in under years of winter's weight. This must have been a rest stop for travelers, Henrik murmured, stepping off the sled. Astrid followed, her boots crunching against the packed snow as she approached the ruins. The cabin's walls had long since begun to bow, but inside, remnants of its past remained. A rusted lantern, broken wooden crates, and near the farthest wall, a bundle of cloth partially buried in the snow. Her breath hitched. Slowly, she knelt and brushed away the frost, revealing a worn leather satchel, stiff from the cold. She lifted it with trembling hands, the weight of it unfamiliar yet oddly significant. Elias crouched beside her. Open it. Astrid swallowed hard and loosened the frozen straps. The flap lifted with a crackling sound, revealing its contents, bundles of parchment, some still sealed, others marked with symbols she didn't recognize. And resting at the very bottom, wrapped in a delicate silk cloth, was a small, ornately carved wooden box. She lifted it carefully, her pulse hammering in her ears. This must be what Johann was carrying. Elias studied it for a moment before exhaling. Letters, documents. These could be trade agreements, maps, or something more. Astrid turned the box over in her hands. The wood was dark, the carvings intricate. It bore no lock, only a sliding panel on the top. With a deep breath, she pushed it open. Inside, nestled in a bed of aged parchment, was a silver ring. Simple in design, yet unmistakably valuable. A hush fell over them as the realization settled in. Henrik let out a low whistle. That's no ordinary ring. Astrid turned it over in her palm, the metal cool against her skin. The engraving along the inside was worn, but still legible. For ML, the promise still holds. Her breath caught. ML Maren Lindström, her grandmother. The wind howled around them, rattling the fragile remnants of the shelter. The truth was becoming clearer. Johann had been returning to Maren, carrying something of great significance. But he had never made it home. Elias exhaled, his expression unreadable. We need to take this back. Astrid nodded. She felt as though she had touched a piece of history, a thread connecting her to a past she had never known. And as they turned back toward the waiting sleds, she knew that whatever had been lost in the snow all those years ago was finally being found. The return journey was silent, save for the rhythmic creak of the sled runners against the frozen ground. The sky had turned a shade of pewter, the faintest promise of an impending snowfall lingering in the air. Astrid held the small wooden box close, her fingers curled around the edges as if the weight of it alone could anchor her thoughts. The ring inside, with its inscription still legible despite the passage of time, felt like a bridge between past and present. Elias guided the lead sled with steady hands, his gaze fixed ahead, while Henrik and the other traders followed closely behind. There was no need for conversation. Each of them understood the significance of what they had uncovered. The past had reached for them through layers of ice and years of silence, and now it rested in Astrid's hands, waiting to be understood. The village came into view as dusk began to settle, its warm glow flickering between the trees. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the scent of pine and wood smoke drifted toward them, a welcoming contrast to the sharp chill of the open tundra. As they entered the main square, villagers turned to greet them, their faces etched with curiosity and concern. Ingrid was the first to approach, her weathered hands clasped in front of her as she studied their expressions. "You have found something," she said, not as a question, but as a knowing statement. Astrid nodded and slowly lifted the box. A piece of the past. Ingrid's gaze flickered toward Elias, then back to Astrid. "Come inside, you must tell me everything." The longhouse was warm, the fire at its heart burning low but steady. Shadows danced along the wooden walls, the familiar carvings of reindeer and constellations feeling more alive than ever. Astrid settled onto a fur-lined bench, placing the box between them on the thick wooden table. The villagers gathered close, their whispers hushed, their eyes bright with anticipation. Elias spoke first, recounting the discovery at the ruined shelter, the satchel buried in the snow, the ring tucked away as if waiting for someone to find it. Henrik added details of the journey, the markings they had followed, the weight of history pressing upon them as they unearthed what had been lost. But it was Astrid who lifted the ring from its resting place and held it up to the firelight. "For ML," she read aloud, "the promise still holds." A hush fell over the room. Ingrid let out a quiet breath, her fingers brushing against the delicate silver band. "Maren Lindström," she murmured, as if the name alone carried the echoes of an entire lifetime. She never spoke of this. Astrid swallowed. Johann was coming back for her. He never made it. Ingrid's eyes shone with something between sadness and understanding. She waited, she said. Not in words, not in letters, but in the way she never truly settled, in the way she would watch the horizon when winter came. Astrid felt a lump form in her throat. The weight of history had shifted, filling in the missing spaces of a story that had been left unfinished for so long. And yet, it was not closure that settled in her chest, but something else, something lighter, a release. The fire crackled softly as Ingrid reached out and folded Astrid's hands around the ring. "You have brought him home," she said, "and now perhaps the waiting can end." Astrid looked down at the silver band resting against her palm, then at the faces surrounding her, the people who had carried these stories without even knowing. The past had been found, but more than that, it had been returned. As the snow began to fall outside, blanketing the village in soft white, Astrid knew she had followed the right path, not just for Johann or for her grandmother, but for herself. She had come north to understand where she belonged, and now she finally knew. The snow had settled thick upon the village, muffling footsteps and cloaking rooftops in pristine white. The longhouse fire still crackled softly, casting flickering golden light against the carved wooden walls. Outside, the northern wind hummed a quiet lullaby, weaving through the pines like a whispered farewell. Astrid sat by the hearth, the silver ring resting in her open palm. The past had found its way back to her. Johann's journey, his promise, the message frozen in time. And now, as the final embers of his story burned into the present, she felt something within her settle into place. The villagers had dispersed, returning to their homes with the weight of new knowledge, a piece of their history restored. Ingrid sat across from Astrid, her eyes reflecting the light of the fire. She reached out, her weathered fingers brushing the ring once more. "You have done what many could not," Ingrid said softly. "You listened to the past." Astrid exhaled, her breath a quiet sigh. "And now I must decide what to do with it." Elias leaned against the wooden beams, his arms crossed. "Sometimes the past does not ask to be changed," he said. "Only understood." The thought lingered in Astrid's mind as she rose from her seat. She walked toward the door, stepping into the crisp night air. The village lay hushed before her, the only movement the gentle dance of falling snowflakes, illuminated by the lanterns that lined the square. One lantern stood apart from the rest, a single flame flickering inside a weathered glass case, the lantern of Nocturne Hollow. It was said to be lit for those still finding their way home, a beacon in the darkness for souls lost in the winter winds. Astrid held Johann's ring tightly. She had come to this place as a seeker, following the path of a forgotten promise. And now, standing beneath the glow of the lantern, she knew that this story, his story, would never be forgotten again. She knelt before the lantern and carefully placed the ring inside, resting it at the base where the light could touch it. The silver gleamed softly in the firelight, no longer a secret buried beneath the ice, but a memory embraced by the warmth of the village. She whispered his name one final time. "Johann." A gust of wind stirred the snow, but the flame within the lantern burned steady, unwavering. A presence settled over her then, a feeling more than a sound, a sense of peace, of completion. The past no longer called to her with longing, but with gratitude. She felt it in the stillness of the air, in the hush of the village, in the quiet hum of the world around her. As she stood, Elias was there beside her, his gaze steady. "You're staying," Astrid smiled, the decision already made. "I am." The North had called her home, not just to uncover the past but to step into her own place within it. This was where she belonged, among the stories woven into the wind, among the people who carried their history with quiet reverence. The caravan would leave in the morning, but Astrid would not be among them. She had found her journey's end not in the past, but in the present. in the warmth of a village where stories did not fade but endured, carried by the light of a single lantern in the winter dark. And so, beneath the glowing sky of the northern lights, Astrid Linda remained in Nocturne Hollow, where the past and the present would forever meet. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Some stories linger, like the glow of lanterns on a winter's night or a whisper carried by the northern wind. The Winter Caravan is more than a tale. It's a reminder that love endures, that promises find their way home, and that some journeys never truly end. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who may need its warmth, and subscribe for more journeys like this. Because some endings are only the beginning. With warmth and gratitude, Story Planet, good night and sweet dreams.